In the year 1785, on the eastern slope of Edinburgh's Old Town, a survey line was drawn across the mouth of the Cowgate Valley. The engineer was Robert Kay. The commission was civic and practical, a bridge long enough to carry the old town southward across the ravine and connect it with the university district and the rising professional neighborhoods beyond. Kay drew his plans on paper, the city approved them, and in the autumn of that year, the first sandstone blocks were set into the ground at the valley's northern edge. The construction of South Bridge had begun in a specific season, under a named man, at a moment documented in municipal records, not a legend, not an approximation, but a decision made by identifiable people in a city whose administrative paperwork survives. The Cowgate Valley runs east to west, below the southern face of Edinburgh's medieval ridge. It is not a dramatic geographical feature from above. From the high street, the ground simply falls away, steeply, through layers of tenement and close and narrow alley, until it reaches the valley floor, some 40 or 50 feet below. From within the Cowgate itself, looking upward toward the ridge, the height of the escarpment is more apparent. Buildings on the ridge appear to stand on a wall. What Kay and his commissioners proposed was to extend that wall, in effect, to fill the gap between the old town's southern edge and the higher ground on the opposite side of the valley, with a structure large enough and strong enough to carry a new road, and on that road, the weight of buildings constructed directly above it. The proposal was not merely a bridge in the conventional sense. It was a bridge designed to disappear. South Bridge was intended to become invisible almost immediately after its completion, buried beneath the tenements and commercial buildings that would be erected along both sides of its carriageway, so that the road surface crossing the Cowgate would appear, to anyone walking along it, simply to be another Edinburgh street. The carriageway was wide. The buildings along it were planned from the beginning to be substantial. Only at one point, where the bridge's central span crossed the Cowgate itself, would any arch remain open to the air. Every other arch would be built against, walled in, incorporated into the base structure of the surrounding buildings, and sealed from the street on all sides. This is the first and most important fact about South Bridge. What was built was not primarily a crossing, but a platform. The bridge's 19 arches were the means of supporting a raised urban surface, and the Cowgate Arch was the only one of those 19 that was left open because it had to be, because the Cowgate ran beneath it and could not be filled. The other 18 arches were sealed within years of construction, built against on all sides, and subsumed into the fabric of Edinburgh's old town so thoroughly that most people crossing South Bridge today do not know they are crossing a bridge at all. They know only a street, slightly elevated, commercial, busy with foot traffic and shop fronts, unremarkable in the way that very old infrastructure eventually becomes unremarkable. Robert Kay's structural design for the bridge incorporated something beyond the arches themselves. Within the haunches and piers of the bridge's body, the solid masonry mass that fills the space between the road surface above and the valley floor below, a network of vaulted chambers was deliberately built. These were not accidental spaces, not residual cavities, not structural byproducts of the arch geometry. They were planned. They were included in the design from the beginning, constructed with barrel-vaulted stone ceilings that followed the curving logic of the arch above them, fitted with doorways, and in some cases, with simple drainage arrangements. The count eventually documented in later surveys reached 120 chambers of varying size and configuration, distributed through the body of the bridge along its full length. The decision to include these chambers was, at its root, financial. Edinburgh's civic improvement program was expensive, and the bridge's commissioners needed ways to offset the cost of construction against future income. Rentable interior space was a practical solution. The chambers were sized for human occupancy and designed as commercial premises, workshops, storage cellars, trading premises, of the kind that occupied the lower floors of Edinburgh's tenements above ground. If the chambers could be let to tradespeople willing to pay a periodic rent for secure enclosed space in a central urban location, then the bridge would, over time, partly finance itself. This was a calculation made on paper in the mid-1780s by people who had every reason to believe it would work. Construction proceeded over 3 years. The sandstone came from quarries within practical distance of the city. The mortar was lime-based, mixed and applied in the way that Edinburgh's masons had been working for generations. The barrel vaults were formed over temporary wooden centering, the stone laid in courses that curved up from the springer on each side and met at the crown. The centering struck once the mortar had set, and the arch becomes self-supporting. 120 times this process was completed. 120 chambers were formed within the body of the bridge, their ceilings curving a few feet above the height of a standing adult, their walls close enough that 2 people could not pass each other in the narrower passages without turning sideways. The whole of this interior network was dark and enclosed almost from the moment the centering was removed, because the bridge's exterior walls were built against, and the surrounding tenements began to rise immediately. The bridge was formally opened in 1788. The occasion was a civic event. Foot traffic crossed the new carriageway for the first time, moving from the old town southward across the Cowgate Valley on a road surface that felt, to anyone walking it, like solid ground. Below them, in the chambers already incorporated into the bridge's structure, the first tenants had already taken up residence. Lease agreements from the late 1780s record the names of tradespeople who had committed to occupying the vaulted spaces in the months immediately following the opening. Cobblers were among them. Wine merchants appear in the surviving documentation. Other tradespeople, whose specific designations have not all survived into the modern record, are referenced in general terms. These were legitimate commercial tenants, paying rent, using the chambers as working premises. Consider what it meant to work in one of these chambers in the winter of 1788. The chamber would have been roughly rectangular, its ceiling a stone curve beginning at a height of perhaps 5 or 6 feet and rising to perhaps 8 feet at its crown. The walls would have been close enough that the sound of another person in the room was always present, that the acoustics were those of a contained stone box, that every sound reflected back from the surrounding surfaces. The floor was stone, cold through the soles of leather shoes, sweating slightly in damp weather. The only light was what the tenant brought, a tallow candle, perhaps 2. The flame threw a warm circle onto the curving vault above and left the corners in shadow. The air had a particular quality, dry compared to the street above in wet weather, cool and still, carrying the smell of the stone itself and whatever the tenant's trade added to it. Leather and neatsfoot oil, in the case of a cobbler, wood and iron filings, the astringency of wine or spirits in the case of a merchant storing his stock. The cobbler who took one of these leases would have had a last a foot-shaped iron form bolted to a low bench, and a scatter of leather offcuts accumulating on the stone floor as the working day progressed. The candle sat in its holder, somewhere within easy reach, moved occasionally as the work required. Upstairs, above the bridge's road surface, the carriages and foot traffic of Edinburgh crossed back and forth in what would have been, to the man working below, a constant background murmur, not quite audible as individual sounds, but present as a low vibration through the stone, the felt sense of a city in motion directly overhead. The chamber was self-contained. It was a workplace, nothing more. It was built to be exactly what it was, a practical room, inside a practical structure, serving a practical civic purpose. The wine merchant's situation was somewhat different in character, though not in kind. A merchant storing barrels in one of the chambers closer to the cowgate would have moved his stock in through the doorway on a low handcart or sack truck, arranged the barrels along the walls, recorded the inventory in whatever manner he kept his records, and departed, locking the door behind him. The chamber would have held a small quantity of that chill and dark and silence that characterizes all rooms where no one is present. The barrels sat on the stone floor or on low wooden pallets. The stone walls absorbed the cool of the valley air that was always present just outside the arch. It was a cellar in the most straightforward sense of the word, a controlled temperature storage space in a city where the summer could damage wine left in warmer premises above ground. What these early tenants did not yet know, what the engineers and commissioners who had designed the chambers may not have fully appreciated at the point of construction, was that the bridge's road surface above was not waterproof. The carriageway had been laid without an adequate membrane between the traffic surface and the stonework beneath. Edinburgh receives substantial rainfall, and in the colder months, rain falls frequently, falls hard, and has a long time to work at any surface it lands on. Water that fell on the bridge's carriageway did not run efficiently away. It found the joints in the stone. It found the lime mortar. It moved slowly downward through the depth of the structure, following whatever paths of least resistance the construction offered it, until it entered the spaces below. This process did not happen immediately. In the first year or two of the bridge's operation, the chambers may have been only intermittently damp, a wet patch appearing on one wall in particularly wet weather, a small area of efflorescence on a ceiling course, where water had drawn salts to the surface as it evaporated. But over time, the ingress became more persistent. The mortar joints in the road surface above widened slightly as the bridge settled and traffic wore at the surface. The water found more paths downward. The lower courses of the chamber walls began to darken with persistent moisture, the stone changing color from the pale ochre gray of dry sandstone to the deeper brown of stone that was always wet. In the far corners of some chambers, where the geometry of the vault concentrated drainage, a slow drip began, not dramatic, not sudden, simply present, regular, and getting worse. The lease agreements that survive from the early 1790s tell the story in practical terms. Commercial tenants who had taken up premises in the bridge's chambers in the years immediately following the 1788 opening began, in the course of that first decade, not to renew. A cobbler whose stock of leather is persistently damp is a cobbler whose materials are compromised. A wine merchant whose storage cellar has a wet floor is a merchant whose barrels are at risk of rot at the base and contamination of their contents. And the chambers had been designed as rentable commercial space, and they were failing at that function not because of any human decision, but because of a simple physical fact. Water moves downward, through stone, when it is given enough time and no reason to stop. By the turn of the 19th century, most of the commercial leases had lapsed. The bridge continued to function above. The carriageway carried its traffic. The tenements and commercial buildings that had been erected along the bridge's length continued to be inhabited and traded from in the normal way. None of this required any change to what lay below. The chambers were simply vacated, their doorways perhaps left open for a time, their interiors gradually accumulating the particular quality of spaces that have been used and are no longer being used. The leather offcuts still on the floor, the last candle holder still on the bench, the residue of commerce in the form of small lost things and accumulated dust. Then, in some cases, the doorways were sealed or built against, and the chambers became interior spaces within the body of the bridge that had no remaining connection to the functioning city above. The geometry of what had been built remained intact. The barrel vaults continued to hold. The stone piers continued to transmit the load of the bridge's road surface and the buildings above it down through the structure to the ground below. Everything that had been carefully engineered into the fabric of South Bridge in the years between 1785 and 1788 was still working, still sound in the structural sense, still performing its intended mechanical function. What had ceased to work was the commercial logic that had justified the chamber's inclusion. The human purpose had failed. The structure had not. What the chambers became in the years and decades following the end of commercial tenancy was a question the bridge's engineers had not been asked to answer. They had built a practical structure for a practical city. The chambers had been intended to generate income and provide workspace. When those functions lapsed, no one had occasion to make an immediate alternative plan for the spaces. They were inside a bridge, after all, dark and cold, and now demonstrably wet, with no obvious secondary use presenting itself. The city went about its business on the carriageway above. The chambers below settled into something between disuse and abandonment, still enclosed, still structurally present, still shaped exactly as they had been shaped when the centering was struck from each vault. In turn, in the late 1780s, the Cowgate below continued in its own life, which was already, by the late 18th century, distinct from the life of the ridge above. The single visible arch of South Bridge crossed the Cowgate at a height that made it a local landmark. When light fell correctly, when the time of day was right, the underside of the arch was visible from the valley floor as a curving sandstone soffit, stained in the way that all Edinburgh sandstone stains, with urban weather and time, but still clearly showing the quality of its original cut. Behind the visible arch, behind the walls of the surrounding buildings that had been built against the bridge's exterior, the 18 sealed arches continued unseen, not hidden in any deliberate sense, simply enclosed. Present as everything built of stone is present, in the permanent and patient way of solid structures that have no need to announce themselves. The water continued to move. This was, in the end, the most consequential physical process that continued within the bridge's interior during the years of commercial abandonment. On the bridge's road surface above, in the autumn rains and the winter frosts, water entered the structure through every available joint and crack in the carriageway. It moved through the depth of the sandstone at the pace of slow infiltration, not flowing, not running, but percolating, finding its way downward through the capillary structure of the stone and the gaps in the mortar, carrying with it the dissolved minerals and organic material of an Edinburgh street. By the time it reached the chamber floors below, it was no longer rain. It was a cold, thin film, spreading across the stone in the dark, carrying a faint smell of the city above, coal smoke and horse traffic, and the particular organic sharpness of a working urban street, absorbed into water and transported 30 feet below the carriages that had produced it. No one was present to observe this process. The chambers were empty and sealed and dark. The water moved across the floors of its own slow logic, finding the low points in the stone surface, pooling in the corners, evaporating from the walls in the drier months, and reappearing in the wet ones. The stone absorbed it, and held it, and changed color as it did. The mortar between the courses absorbed it, and softened slightly at its surface, and grew darker. The vault above each chamber held its curve unchanged. The stone was strong enough, and the load path was clear enough that the water's presence in the haunches and the floor made no structural difference. The bridge bore the weight of Edinburgh's streets exactly as it had been designed to do, and in the chambers within its body, the water gathered and spread and dried and gathered again, year after year, in the dark. The careful, specific quality of what had been built under Robert Kay's direction in those 3 years between 1785 and 1788 persisted through all of this. The decision to include the chambers had been made by named people for documented reasons. The tradespeople who had occupied them had done so under lease agreements that survive in the historical record. The water that had ended their occupation arrived through a specific engineering failure, the absence of an adequate waterproof membrane in the road surface above, that later surveyors were able to identify precisely. Every step of what happened was explicable, traceable, recorded in the kinds of documents that cities generate when they build things and rent them and manage them and let them fall into disuse. The vaults were built in good faith. They were occupied in good faith. They were abandoned because the environment within them became unsuitable for the purposes they had been built to serve. And the abandonment was a practical decision made by tradespeople who had a choice. They left their chambers and found premises elsewhere, and the chambers behind them went dark, and the rain went on, falling on South Bridge above, and the water went on moving through the stone, and the 120 barrel vaulted rooms that Robert Kay had incorporated into the body of his bridge became a space that Edinburgh did not immediately know what to do with. Outside, on the surface of the Cowgate, the single visible arch remained. In certain seasons, at certain times of day, the quality of light under that arch was particular, the sandstone catching the low afternoon sun from the west and holding it briefly in a warm curve before the shadow came again. The people who passed through the Cowgate beneath the bridge's span in those decades had no reason to consider what lay sealed inside the bridge above them. The structure was simply part of the environment of that part of the city, as familiar and unremarked as the cobbles underfoot or the tenement walls rising on each side. 30 feet above the Cowgate's floor and 30 feet below the carriageway's surface, the sealed chambers held their dimensions unchanged. In the coldest chambers, those whose geometry concentrated the water most effectively, whose exposure to any seasonal variation in temperature was most limited by their depth within the bridge's body, the film of water on the floor was present through most of the year. It pooled in the low corners. It spread across the stone in a surface too thin to hear moving, and too cold, and too still to carry any warmth. It had been accumulating in this way since the last commercial tenant had departed with the last candle, and would continue to do so as long as the bridge's road surface remained as it was, and the autumn rains fell on Edinburgh, and the water found its way downward through the stone in the dark. This was what had been built and what had been lost in a single decade, a network of 120 chambers, deliberately incorporated into the fabric of a civic bridge, occupied briefly by tradespeople with candles and crates and leather and wine, and then left to the cold and the water and the long dark of sealed stone. The structure remained. The vaults remained. The geometry of every barrel vaulted room persisted exactly as it had been formed by the striking of Kay's wooden centering in the late 1780s. What had gone was the human purpose, the commercial logic, the candle flame, the sound of tools on leather, and the distant creak of a barrel being rolled into place. What remained in the chambers below Edinburgh's streets was the patient fact of stone and water and dark, and the very quiet that settles into a room that has been sealed and has nothing left inside it to disturb. Sometime in the early years of the 19th century, a family moved into one of the deeper vault chambers beneath South Bridge. The record does not preserve their name. It does not give the exact year, or the month, or the number of children, or what the father had done before this became necessary. What the record does preserve, in parish documents, in church reformers' surveys, in the notebooks of social investigators who descended into the old town's lower levels with careful eyes and careful pens, is the simple documented fact that this happened, that families lived in the abandoned commercial chambers of the bridge, that the departure of the last tradesman created a vacancy that destitution was quick to fill. The transition was not announced. There was no formal moment at which the vaults changed hands from commerce to habitation. It was quieter than that and more gradual. A cobbler's lease lapsed. The chamber stood empty for a season. Then someone was sleeping in it. Then someone had brought a second person. Then there were rags on the stone floor and a stub of candle, and the slow accumulation of the small things that constitute a life held together with very little. The stone of the chamber did not change. The barrel-vaulted ceiling did not change. The damp along the lower courses of the walls continued its slow work regardless. What changed was only the nature of the human presence below the street, and even that change was less a single event than a slow drift from one kind of occupation to another. The old town of Edinburgh in this period was documented by contemporary observers as one of the most densely populated urban environments in Europe. The figures varied depending on the survey and the method of counting, but what all of the accounts agreed on was the compression, the sheer number of people living in a very small area of very old stone buildings, stacked many stories high, without adequate sanitation, without reliable water supply, without ventilation in any meaningful sense. Social investigators who moved through the closes and winds of the old town in the early decades of the 19th century described what they found there in terms that were precise and unsparing. The lower levels were the worst. The lower the level, the worse the condition. And below the lowest level of the street was the bridge, and inside the bridge were the vaults, and in the vaults the conditions were lower still. What the parish records show is not simply poverty, but a specific kind of poverty shaped by the particular character of the space. The vaults offered shelter. That was their primary attraction, and it was not a small thing in a city where shelter could not be assumed, and where winter on the exposed closes of the old town was genuinely dangerous. The barrel-vaulted stone chambers did not collapse. They held the weight above them. They kept the rain out in the most basic sense. The interior of a chamber was drier than an exposed doorway, though rarely by a comfortable margin. They offered walls. They offered a ceiling. They offered a door, or a passage, or some arrangement of the chamber's architecture that allowed a family to define an interior from an exterior and to feel in whatever degree enclosed and contained. These were not small advantages in the context in which they were offered. What the chambers did not offer was warmth. The stone conducted cold rather than holding heat, and the absence of any means of heating a space enclosed in 18-inch sandstone walls meant that the temperature inside a vault in December was not substantially different from the temperature outside it. A family sheltering in one of the deeper chambers in the winter months of the early 1800s would have slept cold. They would have been cold when they woke. The stone floor beneath whatever rags or salvaged cloth they had managed to accumulate would have held its cold through the night and through the following day without releasing it, the way stone does. The barrel-vaulted ceiling above them, that precise and carefully engineered arch that had been designed to distribute load efficiently across a sandstone bridge built to last for generations, would have been cold to the touch at any hour. The walls, darkened along their lower courses by the damp that percolated through from the road surface above, would have been cold and wet together. The conditions were not metaphorically cold. They were physically, measurably, consistently cold, and the records note this in the flat language of people documenting facts rather than dramatizing them. There was no natural light in the deeper chambers. The vaults that had once housed wine merchants and cobblers had never been designed with windows to the street. They were interior spaces within the body of the bridge, accessible by passage and by stair, but separated from the outside world by stone on every side. A family living in one of these chambers would not have seen daylight from within their space. They would have gone out to find it, and come back in and lost it again, and spent the greater part of their hours in a darkness relieved only by whatever small light they had managed to secure. A tallow candle, perhaps, a rushlight, a borrowed flame. The archaeological record from later excavations of the vault sediment includes fragments of candlestick and lamp, material confirmation of what the documentary record already suggests, that the people who lived in the chambers lived in the dark by preference and by necessity, because the alternative was no light at all. The church reformers who documented the vault communities in the early decades of the 19th century were not neutral observers. They came with an interpretive framework and a set of conclusions they had already reached, and their accounts carry that bias in every sentence. But beneath the reforming rhetoric, the specific details they recorded are consistent with each other and with the material evidence that later investigation produced, and it is in those specific details that the texture of vault life becomes visible. One reformer described a chamber containing a family of 7, the children ranging from an infant to a child of perhaps 10, the floor covered with straw that had become wet and was beginning to decay. Another described a passage through which 3 separate families had established what amounted to neighboring residences, each one occupying a distinct vault bay and maintaining some form of territorial understanding with the others. The specific details differ, but the pattern they describe is the same: a community of people who had been pushed to the lowest available option and were making the fullest possible use of it. The City Watch records from the same period document a different kind of presence in the vaults. Alongside the families living in the chambers out of destitution, the Warren-like layout of the vault network made it useful for activities that required concealment and resistance to official intrusion. The records document raids on the vault spaces in search of illegal gambling operations, card games, dice, the organized competition that accompanied any dense urban population, and its need for entertainment, and describe the characteristic difficulty of policing the chambers effectively. The vault network branched and narrowed, passages turned and met other passages. A group in one chamber could hear movement in the adjoining passage before the movement reached them, and the deeper chambers offered retreat routes that the watch, unfamiliar with the layout and hampered by their torches, could not follow quickly. The records note smuggled goods recovered from the chambers on multiple occasions, alcohol primarily, and tobacco, and the language used in these accounts suggests that the watch understood the vaults as an established and difficult problem rather than an occasional nuisance. The space itself assisted evasion. The stone walls absorbed noise selectively. The branching layout multiplied the options for retreat. Anyone who knew the chambers well had a structural advantage over anyone entering them from outside for the first time. There is something particular about the image of the City Watch moving through those passages by torchlight. Their torches would have thrown shifting orange light across the barrel vaulted ceilings and the closed stone walls, illuminating a few feet of passage ahead and leaving everything else in dark. The sound of their footsteps on the stone floor would have carried ahead of them through the chambers, Stone transmits footfall efficiently, and in a network of connected chambers, someone moving with purpose in one part of the vault produces sounds that arrive in other parts of the vault before the person does. The sounds of retreating footsteps that the watch reported hearing, disappearing ahead of them into passages that their torchlight had not yet reached, were real sounds made by real people who had heard the watch coming and had made use of whatever the stone and the dark and the familiar geography of the chambers provided. The vaults were navigated by people who knew them well in the dark. They navigated them that way because they lived there, and the dark was simply the condition of the place. Water was present. It had always been present since the first winter after the bridge opened and the rain began its work through the unprotected road surface above. In the decades that followed the departure of the commercial tenants, the water ingress had continued without any intervention to address it, and the vault walls and floors had absorbed the consequence of this over time. The lower courses of stone were perpetually damp. The floor in the deepest chambers held a thin, cold film of water in wet weather. The mortar between the sandstone blocks had softened in places, not enough to threaten the structural integrity of the arch. The arch was doing its load-bearing work as reliably as it had ever done, but enough to darken the stone and change the quality of the air inside the chambers. The air in the deeper vaults in the early 19th century would have been cold, damp, and still in the way that enclosed stone spaces are still, not the stillness of the countryside, which is a natural quiet, but the stillness of a space that has no circulation, no movement, no connection to the outside air beyond whatever seeped through the cracks in the mortar and the gaps around the passage doors. The people who lived in that air, day after day and month after month, lived in conditions that the contemporary documentary record and the subsequent medical record both identify as conditions for disease. Disease was documented throughout the Old Town population in this period. Cholera arrived in Edinburgh in epidemic form in 1832, and its progress through the densely populated lower quarters of the Old Town was recorded in detail by medical observers who tracked the outbreak street by street and close by close. Typhus was endemic at a level that made individual outbreaks difficult to distinguish from the background rate of infection. Tuberculosis was present throughout the population and concentrated in the areas of poorest housing, poorest nutrition, and poorest ventilation, all of which described the vault communities with precision. The cold and damp of the chambers, which would have been the conditions of every day of every year, were conditions in which respiratory disease spread and persisted. The absence of sanitation, no removal of waste, no clean water supply, no means of maintaining the basic hygiene that the reformers were beginning to understand as a precondition of health, meant that the ordinary transmission routes for waterborne disease were effectively unobstructed. The vault communities were not simply poor. They were living in conditions that the medical understanding of the period, even in its partial and developing form, was beginning to identify as actively dangerous. The church bells that marked the dead during the cholera outbreak of 1832 would have been audible in the chambers below the street. Sound travels through stone, and through the mortar joints between stones, and through the sealed arches of an 18th century sandstone bridge, and a bell being rung with purpose above South Bridge would have sent a vibration down through the structure and into the air of the chambers 30 feet below the roadway. Whether the people in those chambers counted the bells or knew what they meant on a given day, or connected the sound above to what was moving through the population they were part of, the record does not say. What it says is that the epidemic reached the Old Town, that it moved through the densely packed population of the closes and the lower levels, that the vault communities, by virtue of their conditions and their isolation, were among the most vulnerable of those populations. The bells rang, the sound reached the stone. The social isolation of the vault communities is a recurring theme in the contemporary accounts and in the later historical analysis. The families and individuals who sheltered in the chambers were not simply poor in the way that other Old Town residents were poor. They were additionally removed from the ordinary channels of civic life in ways that compounded their disadvantage. They had no formal address in a period when formal address mattered for access to the parish relief that was the primary mechanism of social support. They had no standing with the authorities who might otherwise have provided some form of assistance, and their relationship with those authorities, documented in the city watch records, was adversarial by default. They were not counted reliably in the population surveys of the period. They moved through the city and beneath the city in ways that left incomplete traces. The reformers who documented them did so partly because it was otherwise difficult to establish that they existed at all, that the chambers beneath the bridge contained a population that the ordinary civic record had mostly failed to see. This invisibility extended, in some cases, to the circumstances of death. The vault communities, cut off from the formal institutions of the city above, did not always have ready access to the mechanisms of formal burial when someone died within the chambers. The established burial grounds of Edinburgh, Greyfriars, Canongate, the other churchyards of the Old Town were not inaccessible in principle, but for a family or a group of individuals who had no standing with the parish, no connection to the church, no resources to meet the fees that formal burial might involve, access in practice was a more complicated question. The archaeological investigations that opened in the vault chambers after their rediscovery in the latter part of the 20th century found evidence consistent with this complication. Human remains were identified in contexts that did not correspond to formal burial arrangements, not in dedicated graves with the orientations and grave goods that formal Christian burial of the period would have produced, but in arrangements that suggested improvisation, necessity, proximity, the decision to enter a person in or close to the space in which they had lived and died, rather than to carry them through the passages and up to the street and through the formal channels of the city above. The archaeologists who found these remains worked with the precision and the care that archaeological investigation requires. The bones were catalogued. Their positions were recorded. The sediment layers in which they occurred were placed within the stratigraphic sequence that the excavations were building. This is how material evidence becomes historical knowledge, through the patient, methodical work of people who understand that what is in the ground is the irreplaceable record of what happened, and that the irreplaceable record deserves to be handled with exactness. The human remains from the vault excavations are a part of that record. They are evidence of real individuals who lived in the chambers and died in or near them, and whose last arrangements were made by people who were doing their best in conditions that allowed very little. The bones are small, the contexts are modest. The record they add to is one of the most important kinds of record there is, not the record of notable events or famous names, but the record of ordinary lives lived in difficult circumstances, evidence that specific people occupied a specific place and that their presence there was real. The clay pipes recovered from the vault sediment during excavation are another kind of presence. A clay pipe bowl is a small object. It fits easily in the palm of a hand. The ones recovered from the vault deposits are worn smooth at the stem, in the way that pipes become worn when they are handled daily, when they are the one small regular comfort available to a person who has very few regular comforts and holds the ones they have with some frequency. The glaze on the ceramic fragments recovered from the same deposits, cream-colored on one face, crackled from years of damp, is the glaze of ordinary domestic pottery, the kind used in the preparation and consumption of food in any household of the period. These objects were not brought into the chambers for display or for storage. They were used in the chambers. They were part of daily life in the chambers. The leather fragments recovered from the deepest vault deposits, stiffened and darkened by the damp and the years, some of them identifiable as shoes, are the most specific kind of ordinary artifact, because shoes are worn, and worn shoes carry the shape of the foot they were worn on, and the foot they were worn on was the foot of a person. The fragments of children's shoes are the ones that the documentary record notes with particular care. Several pairs or portions of pairs recovered from vault sediment and laid out on an archaeological table for examination and cataloging, each one numbered, each one documented in the site record with the precision that the process demands. Small shoes, leather shoes, the leather dark and stiff from the damp and the years. The kind of shoes that a child in Edinburgh in the early 19th century would have been given when shoes could be provided and would have worn until the leather gave way. A child wearing those shoes was a child living in the vaults, sleeping in the cold, hearing whatever could be heard through 30 feet of stone and sandstone arch, going out to the street above and coming back in again, knowing the passages and the chambers in the particular way that children know the places they inhabit, not as spaces with historical significance or architectural interest, but simply as the world as it is, the world they live in, the world that is ordinary, because they have no other one to compare it to. The documentary record of the vault communities ends gradually, in the way that things end when they are not recorded with precision. Conditions in the old town continued to deteriorate through the first half of the 19th century, and then began, slowly and unevenly, to improve as public health reform produced new infrastructure and new regulation. The vault communities did not end on a particular date. They diminished. The worst of the chambers became uninhabitable, even by the standards of the people who had been using them. Other options, marginally better, became available in the city above. The vaults, already dark and damp and isolated, became emptier over time, and then at some point, the record does not give the date, empty. The last person to sleep in a vault chamber left or died there, and the chambers were sealed behind them, the passages closed, the bricked-up doorways mortared shut, and the vaults began the long, undisturbed interval between their abandonment and their eventual rediscovery. That interval lasted for over a century. During those years, the vaults sat in darkness behind their sealed entrances, the stone continuing to bear the weight of the street above as it had always done, the water continuing to move through the mortar joints and gather along the lower courses of the walls. Nothing was removed. The sediment that had accumulated during the period of habitation, the soil and debris of daily life in the chambers, the material record of the commercial tenants, and the families who came after them, lay undisturbed. The artifacts in that sediment, the clay pipes, the ceramic fragments, the leather shoes, the coins and the buckles, and the remnants of furniture, lay where they had been dropped or left or placed, held in the cold and the dark by the same stone that had held everything else. What the archaeological investigations eventually found in that sediment was not simply objects. It was evidence of a continuous human occupation stretching from the 1790s to somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, preserved in stratified layers that the careful work of excavation was able to read like a slow document. The commercial period at the bottom, the period of impoverished habitation above it, and through both periods, The same physical environment, the same stone ceiling, the same stone walls, the same cold and dark and damp, holding whatever human life was present within it, without judgment and without alteration. The chambers themselves were indifferent to who was in them. They had been built for commerce and used for habitation, and then emptied and sealed, and they had waited exactly as they had been built to wait for whatever came next. The remains found in the vault chambers, those contexts identified by the archaeologists as consistent with informal or improvised burial, are the most direct connection between the documented human history of the vaults and the physical reality of the stone space. A person who died in the chambers and was interred within them or immediately adjacent to them became, in the most literal sense, part of the vault's archaeology. Their bones joined the sediment. They became a stratum. They became evidence. Decades later, the gloved hands of archaeologists with brushes and clipboards and site recording forms would work down through that sediment and find them and document them with the same careful attention given to every fragment of ceramic and every worn leather sole, because the record is the record and what it holds should be held honestly. The bones were small in some cases. The circumstances of their interment were modest. The weight of what they represent is not small and not modest at all. The vaults were someone's entire world. This is not a figure of speech. For a child who grew up in one of the deeper chambers, who knew the barrel-vaulted ceiling above, and the cold stone floor below, and the sound of the city watch moving through the passages outside, and the faint vibration of the bells ringing above, the vault chamber was the primary geography of existence. The street above was another world, visited but not lived in. The sky was something encountered rather than inhabited. The chambers, their dimensions, their smells, their particular quality of darkness, their temperature at different seasons, the sounds that the stone transmitted from other chambers, and from the bridge structure, and from the road surface, 30 feet above. These were the ordinary, unremarkable, daily facts of a life being lived in a specific place, ordinary in the way that any place is ordinary to the person who lives there, specific in the way that any place is specific to the person who knows it well. The archaeological record holds the trace of that knowledge. The worn clay pipe stem holds the trace of the hand that held it. The leather of the shoes holds the trace of the foot that wore them. The mortar of the walls holds the trace of the hand that touched it over years of daily passage through the chambers. These are traces in the sense that evidence is a trace, not the thing itself, but the persistent mark that the thing left in the material it moved through. The vaults are full of those marks. The sediment in which they sit is the accumulated evidence of lives that the ordinary civic record largely failed to document, and the archaeological work of recovering and cataloging that evidence is a form of attention that those lives were not often given while they were being lived. The chambers are quiet now. The stone that was cold for all the years of habitation is still cold. The water that moved through the mortar joints during those years is still moving through them, as it has always moved, gathering in the thin, cold film along the floor of the deepest chambers and finding whatever low point the stone provides for it. The barrel-vaulted ceilings curve at the same height they have always curved, just above a standing person's head, just enough clearance for daily life, conducted in a space not designed for daily life. The sediment is there, below the stone floor, holding what it holds. And somewhere in that sediment, carefully documented and properly recorded and held in the slow, patient archive of things that the material world preserves without being asked to, the bones of people who lived here continue to exist in the dark. In 1985, In a basement room beneath a building on South Bridge, a man named Norrie Rowan stood in front of a bricked-up doorway and found that the mortar around its edges was old enough to crumble at a touch. He had purchased property above the bridge some time before, and in the course of looking into what lay beneath it, he had followed the stonework down and arrived at this point, a sealed entrance, a wall that had been built not to carry weight, but to close something off. The air around the edges of it was different from the air in the room behind him. It was cooler, and it moved very slightly, as though something on the other side of the wall was breathing in a slow and measured way that had nothing to do with him. He broke through. The chamber that opened ahead of him had been sealed for well over a century. What he found inside was not ruin. That is the detail that people who have spent time in the vault, rediscovery accounts tend to come back to first. Not the darkness, not the cold, not the strangeness of a space no one had entered in living memory, but the degree to which the chambers were simply there. Stone walls, barrel-vaulted ceilings curving to a peak a few feet above a standing person's head, a floor of compressed sediment, dark and undisturbed, which had been accumulating in its particular silence for somewhere between 100 and 150 years. The chambers had not collapsed. The sandstone arches had held. The South Bridge structure had done what it was built to do, which was bear the weight of the city above it, and it had been doing this without interruption in the dark for longer than anyone still living had been alive. Rowan's rediscovery of the vault network was the beginning of a process that would take years and involve a number of different people with different kinds of expertise, different purposes, and different relationships to what the chambers contained. It was not an immediate or dramatic transformation. The vaults did not open to the public in a single moment. What happened instead was slower and more careful than that, a gradual accumulation of understanding, an incrementally expanding map, and a set of questions about what the chambers held and what should be done with what they held. These questions are still being asked. Some of them have not been answered. The earliest and most structurally significant work following Rowan's entry was archaeological in nature, or at least archaeological in method. Surveys were conducted that mapped the vault network in systematic detail, establishing the extent of the chamber system and the relationship between its different sections. The vaults beneath South Bridge are not a simple row of connected rooms. They branch, they narrow, they open into larger spaces, and then close again. Some chambers communicate directly with adjacent ones. Others are accessible only through sequences of passages that require navigation by someone who has been there before. The early surveys produced maps, and those maps confirmed that the chamber network was more extensive than surface-level inspection of the bridge's architecture had suggested to anyone who had not been inside it. Within the sediment on the chamber floors, those early surveys also identified something that archaeologists describe as stratigraphy, the layered record of sequential occupation and use, compressed into the floor deposit like the pages of a book that has been slowly pressed flat over a very long time. Different layers within the sediment corresponded to different periods of the chamber's history. There was a layer associated with the period of commercial tenancy, the cobblers, the wine merchants, the tradespeople who had used the chambers as workshops and storage spaces in the years immediately following the bridge's completion. Above that, in the stratigraphic sequence, there was a layer corresponding to the period of impoverished habitation, the decades in the early 19th century when families had sheltered in the chambers after the commercial tenants had gone, and above that, a third and different kind of deposit, the long quiet of closure, the gradual accumulation of the years when no one had been here at all. Each layer was a different texture, a different density, a different darkness. Together they made a record of the chambers that was entirely material, entirely readable to those who knew how to read it, and entirely silent about what it had been like to be present in any of these periods as a living person in a body with a specific face and name. The material culture recovered from those layers confirmed and extended what the documentary record had already established. Ceramic fragments came out of the sediment, pieces of everyday vessels, the ordinary domestic objects of people who had lived here without access to the amenities that the city above them took for granted. Clay pipe fragments were found in some numbers. Pipes like these, in contexts like these, turn up in urban archaeological excavations across Britain. From this period, they are the residue of a particular kind of daily comfort, the small portable warmth of a thing that could be lit and held and drawn on in cold and difficult circumstances, and their presence in the vault deposits is one of the clearest indications that the chambers were genuinely lived in, not merely passed through. Glass bottle fragments, coins, buckles, remnants of furniture reduced by time and damp to their most skeletal forms, all of it was documented, catalogued, assigned a position in the stratigraphic record, and added to the accumulated material evidence of the vault communities. There were also items of clothing, fragments of leather, stiffened and darkened by the particular chemistry of long burial in a cold and damp environment, were recovered from the sediment in context that left no ambiguity about their origin. Some of these fragments were small enough to have belonged to children. The archaeologists who handled and catalogued them did so with the same careful attention they brought to everything else in the deposit: a measurement, a photograph, a number in the log, but the smallness of certain objects in the record carries its own weight, regardless of the register in which it is documented. The vaults were a place where families had lived, and families include children, and the material evidence of that fact sits in the archaeological record in exactly the form that it takes when a careful science handles the evidence of lives that were, by any external measure, very hard. Norrie Rowan's rediscovery had made the vault network known to a wider circle of people. Word of what lay beneath Southbridge spread, as it tends to do when an urban space turns out to have a hidden interior that most of the city above it had entirely forgotten about. The question of what to do with the chambers, how to make them accessible, how to present them, how to balance the interest of the public in experiencing them against the structural and preservational concerns that any candid assessment of the chambers raised, was not resolved quickly or easily, and the answer that emerged over the following years was not a single answer, but a set of overlapping and sometimes competing ones. Among the earliest operators to develop a structured approach to public access was the company known as the Caddies and Witchery Tours, founded by a man named Jan Andrew Henderson. Henderson's approach was grounded in the documented historical material, the architecture of the bridge, the social history of the vault communities, the recorded facts of the chamber's construction and abandonment, and it was this historical grounding that shaped the template his tours established. The early witchery tours into the vault chambers in the first years of the 1990s moved through the low barrel vaulted passages by torchlight, the group small, the pace unhurried, the guide's account careful enough to distinguish between what the historical record established and what was reported, witnessed, or held by tradition. The distinction mattered, and Henderson's approach made it visible rather than collapsing it. What the torchlight found on those first tours was what it finds now, which is the same stone that has been there since 1788, the same sandstone walls, the same curve of the barrel vault overhead, the same floor beneath the carefully prepared surface. the same sealed entrances to the chambers beyond the tour route. The light was the thing that was new. The chambers had existed for a very long time in the absence of sustained artificial illumination, and the experience of bringing light back into them after such a prolonged interval of darkness was described by early visitors in terms that had more to do with the quality of the space than with anything the light revealed. The vaults, seen by torchlight for the first time in generations, looked exactly like what they were: old rooms built well, used hard, and then forgotten for a long time in the dark below. A city that had stopped thinking about them. Subsequent tour operators developed their own versions of the vault experience, each one working with the same physical infrastructure, while making different choices about what to emphasize, what to frame, and how to position the reported phenomena that had begun by the mid-1990s to accumulate in the accounts of guides and visitors. Mercat Tours, which became one of the longest established operators running underground experiences in Edinburgh, developed its own detailed archive of visitor and guide accounts over the course of many years of regular tours through the Vault network. The existence of this archive, informal, accumulated over time, rather than designed from the outset as a research resource, is itself a consequence of the fact that visitors kept reporting experiences in the chambers that fell outside the ordinary range of what people expect from a historical tour. The archive grew because the accounts kept coming, but that belongs to a slightly later part of the Vault's history in public memory. The immediate years following rediscovery were primarily a period of physical investigation, cartographic work, and the beginning of the slow institutional negotiation about what the chambers represented and how they ought to be treated. Heritage bodies, with interests in the preservation of historic structures, had concerns that were not difficult to articulate. The South Bridge vaults were built of sandstone, a material that weathers under moisture. The chambers had been subjected to chronic water ingress since shortly after their construction. This was the condition that had driven out the commercial tenants in the 1790s, and nothing in the intervening 2 centuries had done anything to address it. The road surface above the bridge still permitted water to penetrate. The stone was still damp. The mortar in certain sections was still degrading, slowly, in the particular way that mortar degrades when it is kept persistently wet, and then dried, and then wet again across many seasons. Structural assessments conducted by engineers following Rowan's rediscovery identified sections of the vault network that were too unstable for safe public access. The distinction between the chambers that could be open to visitors and the chambers that could not was not, in most cases, a matter of dramatic structural failure, collapsing arches, fallen ceilings, walls about to give way. It was subtler than that. A hairline crack running from the floor to the ceiling of a chamber wall, following the line of a mortar joint, indicated something about the distribution of load above it that an experienced structural assessor could read with a reasonable degree of certainty. A pier that was damp to the touch through its entire visible height suggested conditions in the stone above it that were not consistent with long-term stability under the weight that pier was carrying. These were not alarming findings, but they were consequential ones, and the portions of the vault network they placed beyond public access remain beyond it today, mapped, assessed, monitored where monitoring is practicable, but not entered by tour groups, not lit, not documented through the lived experience of people moving through them. The tension that the heritage assessors identified between the commercial value of the vault network as a public attraction and the structural welfare of the chambers themselves has not been resolved, because it is not in its nature the kind of tension that can be fully resolved. A space that is visited regularly by tour groups is a space that is subject to minor but continuous physical impact, the vibration of footsteps, the humidity generated by human breath, the wear on floor surfaces over time. A space that is left entirely undisturbed is a space that continues to be subject to the slow processes that the preservationists are trying to arrest. Damp freeze-thaw cycles, the gradual dissolution of the mortar that holds the sandstone blocks in their arches. Neither approach fully protects the chambers. The question is one of balance, and the balance that different operators and heritage bodies strike is not always the same, and the conversation about it continues to be had in the places where such conversations are had, which is to say, in meeting rooms and planning documents and assessment reports, with careful language and qualified conclusions. What the archaeological work produced, in the end, was a record comprehensive in some areas, partial in others, honest about the limits of what the sediment had preserved and what it had not. The stratigraphic layers in the vault floors are a form of document, and like all documents, they are legible only in certain ways. The ceramics confirm the presence of people. The pipe fragments confirm a particular kind of daily life. The coins confirm economic activity of some kind, at some scale in these chambers. The leather confirms clothing, which confirms bodies, which confirms that the vault community was a population of specific individuals with specific faces and specific patterns of daily existence that the archaeological record can hint at, but cannot fully reconstitute. The record is real. It is also incomplete. The things the sediment preserves are the things that happen to end up in the sediment, which is a selection, not a totality, and the selection was made by accident rather than intention. The chambers that Norrie Rowan first entered in 1985 were not, at that moment, a tourist attraction, a research site, or a subject of public historical interest. They were simply a space that had been sealed and forgotten, and the air that moved out of the breach in the brickwork when he made it was the air of that forgetting. Cool, old, carrying nothing identifiable beyond the particular quality of a space that has been enclosed for a very long time. In the years that followed his entry, the vaults became all of those things, attractive to tourists, interesting to archaeologists, significant to preservationists, and by a process whose documentation is less tidy than the archaeological record, associated in the accounts of many visitors and guides, with phenomena that the historical and material record does not address. The archaeological record does not record experiences. It records objects, deposits, structures, and their spatial relationships to one another. What people felt in the chambers, what the vault inhabitants felt during the decades of occupation in the early 19th century, what Norrie Rowan felt when the air from the sealed chamber first reached him, what the early witchery tours visitors felt as they moved by torchlight through the barrel-vaulted passages in the early 1990s. None of this is in the record, because the record does not hold that kind of information. The record holds the clay pipe and the leather fragment and the ceramic shard and the stratigraphic layer. The experience of the people who left those things behind is a question the record raises without answering. The deeper vault chambers, the sections beyond the standard tour route and beyond the reach of the preserved and lit passages, are where the structural assessors pressed their hands against the stone and found it damp. A hairline crack ran from the floor to the ceiling of a wall in one of these chambers, following a mortar joint that had been softening for a long time in conditions that were not ideal for the longevity of historic masonry. The assessors noted the crack, noted the damp, noted the load distribution indicated by both, and made their recommendations. The chamber was sealed. It has been sealed since. The sandstone of its walls and the mortar of its arch continue to be subject to the same processes that they have been subject to for 230 years. the water coming through from the road surface above, the slow dissolution of the lime mortar, the patient, unmeasured work of time on stone. What the surveys also established as a consequence of the mapping work was the full extent of what remained unknown. A map of the vault network is a map of what has been entered and measured and recorded. It is also, by implication, now is a map of what lies adjacent to those known spaces, the sections that were not entered, not measured, not recorded, because the structural conditions within them made entry imprudent, or the access to them had been so thoroughly blocked by the building activity of subsequent centuries that no practicable route through to them had been found. The known vault network is extensive. The unknown portion of the South Bridge structure, the arches and chambers and passages that the bridge's original design incorporated but that no modern survey has accessed, may be more extensive still, or it may have been substantially compromised by the building work carried out on and around the bridge in the 200 years between its construction and its rediscovery. No one knows. The map stops at the edge of what has been entered, and the structure of the bridge continues beyond that edge. Ghost Amsterdam Henderson's tours in the early 1990s were operating at the beginning of a period during which the vault's cultural identity was being constructed in public, a process that involved the documented history, the archaeological findings, the structural assessments, and increasingly the growing body of visitor and guide accounts that attributed to certain areas of the vault network qualities that were not accounted for by the material record. The tours brought these things together into a single experience, and the experience accumulated across many visitors over many years, and the accounts generated by that accumulation became a kind of additional layer in the vault's documentary record, less formal than the archaeological reports, less systematic than the structural surveys, but persistent and consistent in ways that proved difficult to simply set aside. The vaults, as they were presented to early tour visitors, were historical in their primary framing. What the chambers contained, in the account the guides offered, was a documented past, the cobblers and wine merchants of the 1790s, the impoverished families of the early 1800s, the raids and the disease, and the slow emptying of the chambers as the vault communities scattered or died or were displaced. This history was real, and the chambers themselves were its most direct surviving evidence. The stone walls that the torchlight moved across had been those walls throughout all of that history. The barrel-vaulted ceilings had curved above all of those lives. The floor beneath the carefully laid surface of the tour route was the same floor on which all of those people had placed their feet, and under which, in some cases, the archaeological record suggested some of them had been left to rest. The transition from this historical framing to a wider and more contested one was gradual. It did not happen on a particular date or in response to a particular event. It happened the way that such transitions tend to happen in the public life of places with complicated histories, slowly, through the accumulation of individual accounts that each seemed anomalous in isolation, but began, when taken together, to suggest a pattern. A guide who noticed that certain chambers produced consistent effects on visitors, regardless of what those visitors had been told beforehand. A visitor who reported hearing something in an empty passage and found, on comparing notes, that another visitor in a different group on a different evening had reported hearing something similar in the same location. The pattern was not planned. It assembled itself from independent parts, the way patterns in such accounts tend to do, and the question of what the pattern meant was not a question that the material record was equipped to answer. What the material record was equipped to answer was more limited and correspondingly more certain. The vaults were built by Robert Kay, Between 1785 and 1788, they were occupied commercially for a short period and then abandoned to water ingress. They were then occupied in conditions of extreme poverty by families whose names and faces and individual histories are for the most part lost, though the objects they left behind them are not. The chambers were then sealed, in most cases, by the building activity of subsequent decades, and they remained sealed until Norrie Rowan broke through a bricked-up doorway in 1985, and the air from inside reached him for the first time in over a century. These facts are established. They are not contested. They rest in the documentary and material record in the form of lease agreements, social surveys, parish records, archaeological reports, and engineering assessments, and they can be consulted by anyone who wishes to consult them. The chambers themselves, as physical structures, continue to exist in the form they have occupied for over 2 centuries. The lit passages, the carefully prepared tour routes, the portions of the vault network that structural assessors have determined can safely bear regular visitors. These remain accessible, remain documented, remain a part of the city's maintained and public historical infrastructure, and adjacent to them, accessible through doorways that are bricked up or bolted or simply not openable from the side that the tour routes approach them from, the sealed sections of the vault network continue in their own uninterrupted existence. These chambers are dark, they are cold, they are in most cases exactly as undisturbed as they were on the morning before Norrie Rowan broke through his doorway and put the vaults back into the public record. The structural assessors who have visited them have confirmed that they exist, have noted their condition, and have recommended against their opening. Beyond those visits, which were brief and purposeful and limited to what the assessments required, these chambers have not been entered. There is something in this that the maps of the vault network make visible in a way that is worth pausing on. A map of the accessible chambers is also a map of their relationship to the inaccessible ones. The sealed sections are documented not by what is known about their interiors, but by what is known about their boundaries, where they begin, as indicated by the walls and doorways that delimit the accessible portions, and where they presumably end, as indicated by the known dimensions of the South Bridge structure itself. The interior of what lies in between is inferred rather than observed. Floors, walls, vaulted ceilings, the same sandstone construction, presumably, as the chambers that have been entered, subject to the same moisture and the same slow processes, a deposit on the floor that no archaeologist has reached, an air that has not been displaced by human breath since sometime in the 19th century or earlier. The opening of the vaults to public access in the early 1990s was an act of civic and historical curiosity in the most straightforward sense of that description. Henderson and the operators who followed him wanted to bring people into contact with a part of Edinburgh's history that had been for a very long time entirely invisible from the surface. The history was there. The chambers that contained it were there. The work of bringing people to the history and the history to people was in its fundamental nature the same work that archives and museums and heritage sites do every day in every city that has decided its past is worth preserving for its present. The fact that the vaults carried, alongside their documented history, a growing body of reported experience that the documentary record did not account for. This fact complicated the work, but did not displace the history that was its foundation. Both things were present. Both things remained present. Present. The chambers held the archaeological record in their floors, and the structural record in their walls, and the accumulated visitor and guide accounts in the files of the operators who had been leading tours through them for 3 decades. And all of this was simultaneously true. The structural assessors who have visited the deeper and currently sealed sections of the vault network have noted consistently the presence of moisture in the sandstone. The stone is damp. It has been damp in most of its extent for as long as it has been stone in this location, which is to say, since the late 1780s, when the road surface above was laid without adequate waterproofing, and the water from the first Edinburgh winter began its slow transit downward through the mortar joints, finding the chambers below and taking up residence in them, in the patient and unhurried way that water takes up residence in stone structures when it is given sufficient time and insufficient competition. The damp is not alarming. It is simply a condition of the place. It was a condition of the place when the wine merchants were here, and when the families were here, and when no one was here, and it remains a condition of the place now. In the deepest mapped sections of the vault network, where the structural assessments identified the hairline cracks and the degrading mortar and the piers that were wet through their entire visible height, the chambers are as they were. The map shows them. The assessment reports describe them. No sustained light has crossed their walls for a very long time, and the weight of South Bridge's road surface presses down on their arches from above, exactly as it has been pressing for 230 years. The street above them continues its ordinary business. The foot traffic, the vehicles, the rain when it comes, the particular quality of winter light on old stone that belongs specifically to Edinburgh. Below all of this, the sealed chambers hold their cold, their dark, their long and uninterrupted quiet. The case files on the vaults are open in the archives and offices of the operators and the heritage bodies and the research institutions that have attended to the chambers over the decades since Rowan's entry. The doors into the portions of the vault network that remain closed are closed. On the other side of those doors, the stone is exactly as it has always been, bearing the weight it was built to bear. In the dark, it has always occupied, with no account being made, and no account being asked for. The name came from the sound, not from a face or a record or a description anyone filed with an authority that might have kept it. From the sound alone, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through a passage in the South Bridge vaults, where, when the guide turned and checked, no one was walking. That is the whole of the etymology. Someone heard boots on stone in an empty corridor, and the thing that made them was named for what it left behind. What witnesses have continued to report across decades of guided tours, overnight vigils, and independent investigations is not an apparition or a figure or anything that resolves into a shape. It is a sound, the sound of someone walking with purpose through a place where the physical record confirms no one is walking. Merca Tours has operated underground tours of the South Bridge vaults for many years. The company keeps records, informal in places, systematic in others, and those records have accumulated over time into something that researchers and investigators have found genuinely worth examining. Tour guides who have worked the vault passages for extended periods describe a particular quality to the chambers in the deeper sections of the network, chambers that sit further from the stairwells and further from the ambient noise of the street above. Several guides, in recorded conversations with paranormal investigators, have noted that they do not enter certain of those chambers alone, not as a policy, not as a rule handed down from management, simply as a personal decision, arrived at quietly, after enough individual experiences that the preference became fixed. What those experiences consisted of, specifically, and in their own words, is worth following carefully. One recurring account describes a moment of acoustic displacement. A guide is moving through the passage section that runs beneath Nittery Street, the ceiling barrel vaulted above, the walls close enough on either side that two people walking abreast would have to angle their shoulders. Behind the guide, the tour group is present and accounted for, footsteps audible, voices low, torch beams crossing the uneven floor. Ahead, the passage runs to a sealed section of wall, a bricked-up threshold beyond which the chambers have not been opened for structural reasons. What several guides have independently described is the sound of footsteps coming from ahead, not from behind them, where the group is, from ahead, from the direction of the sealed wall. The sound has been described across accounts that were collected separately and without cross-reference at the time, with the same word: deliberate. Not a creak in the stone, not a drip arriving at irregular intervals that the ear reassembles into a rhythm. Deliberate, weighted, advancing. The guides who describe this experience are not, as a category, people who arrived at the vaults having never considered the question of what they might encounter. They work in a context where the paranormal accounts are part of the established operational texture of the site. That is a relevant fact. It does not resolve anything, but it sits in the record alongside the accounts themselves, and any careful reading of the accumulated testimony keeps both things in view. What the guides are describing may be a product of the environment they work in, the preparation, the repetition, the decades of accumulated narrative about what the chambers contain. It may also be something else. The record does not settle this. What it does is establish that the accounts are consistent, that they are collected across many years, that they come from individuals with extended familiarity with the space rather than first-time visitors in heightened states of novelty, and that the specific detail of deliberate footsteps in a passage terminating in a sealed wall appears in multiple independent accounts without having been explicitly planted there by any single guiding narrative. Visitor accounts from Mercat Tours sessions describe a different register of experience, though with overlapping elements. A visitor on an underground tour is in a different condition to a guide. The visitor is encountering the space for the first time. The visitor has, in almost every case, received a detailed narrative introduction to the vaults before entering. The history, the communities that lived below, the nature of the space, and the accounts of what has been reported there. Research on cognitive priming makes clear that this kind of preparation changes the way ambiguous sensory data is processed. A sound that might, in another context, be assigned immediately to traffic vibration or water movement becomes, in the context of a vaulted stone chamber with a preloaded narrative about unexplained footsteps, much more available for a different interpretation. That is not a dismissal of visitor accounts. It is a condition that any honest reading of those accounts has to carry alongside the testimony itself. With that condition acknowledged, the visitor accounts are worth describing specifically. Mercat Tours records note incidents of visitor distress that prompted early departures from the tour, a category of event that the company documents as a matter of operational practice rather than paranormal record-keeping. These incidents are not evenly distributed across the vault network. They cluster in the deeper chambers, in the passages furthest from the entrance stairwells, in the sections of the underground route that approach most closely the sealed-off portions of the network that remain unlit and unvisited. Within those areas, the specific physical sensations reported by visitors across many years include a localized drop in temperature that witnesses describe as distinct from the general ambient cold of the vaults, a cold that arrives suddenly in a particular area of a chamber rather than being uniformly present throughout, a sensation of being followed, described not as the visual impression of a figure behind them, but as a felt awareness of purposeful presence at their back, and a quality of directed attention several visitors describing the specific impression that something in the chamber had become aware of them and was observing them with an interest that was not neutral. None of these reports constitute evidence of anything beyond the sensory experience of the people who had them. That is the honest position, and it is the position the available record supports. What makes them interesting is the pattern, the clustering of reports in specific locations, the recurrence of the same physical descriptors, the localized cold, the sense of following, the felt awareness of attention across accounts given by people who did not know each other and who reported their experiences at different times and in different formats. Pattern in the study of anomalous phenomena does not confirm a cause. It identifies a consistency that is worth examining further and worth holding carefully without reaching past what it actually demonstrates. The overnight investigation sessions conducted in the Southbridge vaults by independent paranormal research teams represent a different category of evidence, gathered under different conditions and with different equipment and methodologies. Several such teams have conducted vigils in the vault chambers over the years, typically with access to the deeper, less visited sections of the network that are not part of the standard tour route. These teams arrive with recording equipment, audio recorders, electromagnetic field meters, temperature gauges, video cameras, and they conduct their sessions in silence or near silence, moving through the chambers slowly, stopping for extended periods in locations identified in prior reports as particularly active, and logging everything they observe with timestamps and coordinates in the vault map. The audio recordings from these sessions are the category of evidence most associated with the Mr. Boots accounts. Several investigation teams have returned from overnight vigils in the vaults with recordings that, when played back, contain sounds the investigators describe as footsteps appearing in passages where the logbook confirms no member of the investigation team was moving. These recordings have been shared with the broader paranormal investigation community, and some have been made available for public review. They have not been submitted to independent acoustical analysis by institutions without prior commitment to a paranormal interpretive framework. That absence does not establish that the sounds on the recordings are not anomalous. It establishes that the recordings remain in a genuinely contested category, documented, time-stamped, available, and unverified in the technical sense of having been assessed by parties with no stake in the outcome. What the recordings sound like, described plainly: a rhythmic percussive impact on a hard surface, spaced with the approximate interval of walking pace, audible at a volume consistent with someone walking at a distance of several meters from the recorder, occurring in a section of passage where the investigation logbook records no one present. The specific acoustic quality varies across recordings from different teams and different sessions. Some investigators describe the sound as heavier than an ordinary footstep, the kind of impact associated with substantial boots on stone, rather than the lighter contact of contemporary footwear. That description is where the name consolidates, where the reported sound and the acoustic record of the recordings converge on the same word: boots. Heavy, deliberate, on stone. The sessions in which these recordings were made also produced data in other categories that investigators log alongside the audio. Electromagnetic field readings from meters carried through the vault chambers show, across multiple independent investigations, and Bay Kaneke, elevated readings in the passages most associated with the Mr. Boots accounts, readings higher than the baseline established in the entrance areas and in the sections of the network furthest from the reported activity. These readings are consistent with the presence of electrical infrastructure in the walls or ceiling above, wiring, conduits, infrastructure associated with the building use above the bridge. And that explanation is one that investigators working in the mainstream scientific tradition would apply first. What the investigators conducting overnight vigils in the vaults note is that the elevated readings are specifically localized, that they appear in corners and in specific sections of passage rather than being uniformly distributed along the route of any likely overhead wiring, and that in several cases the readings appear to shift between sessions, present in one corner of a chamber on one visit and absent on the next. Temperature readings from the same sessions produce a consistent picture of the deep chambers as uniformly cold, running several degrees below the ambient outdoor temperature, regardless of season, a consequence of the stone mass of the bridge acting as a thermal sink that resists daily and seasonal variation. Within that generally cold environment, in Vefit's daily home sessions, that with the Behir, Tanksaimaifs, from the drain Bequengtu in Van Wa, and one came, the temperature data from investigations in the deeper Nidri Street passages shows localized variation, corners and sections of passage running measurably colder than the surrounding chamber, sometimes by several degrees, with the variation not attributable to obvious draught sources. Investigators have documented these readings in logbooks, noted the exact chamber coordinates, and returned on subsequent visits to find the same localized cold in the same locations. Other investigators, working on separate occasions, have found cold spots in matching coordinates without having been given access to the previous team's logbook data before conducting their own survey. The convergence on specific physical locations across independent investigations is the piece of the accumulated record that researchers find hardest to dismiss as simply the product of expectation. Expectation can shape what a person reports experiencing in a general sense. It is more difficult to construct a purely expectation-based account of why multiple investigation teams, working without knowledge of each other's specific findings, identify the same corner of the same passage as the location of an anomalous temperature reading, or note in their audio logs that the footstep sounds appear most frequently in the stretch of the Nidri Street section that approaches most closely the sealed wall at the far end. The evidence does not establish what is causing the consistency. It does establish the consistency itself, and that is a meaningful distinction. Mercator's guides who have worked the vaults over extended periods describe a range of experiences beyond the acoustic. Several have noted the experience of entering a chamber that had been empty and finding the temperature in a specific area of the chamber changed in a way that did not match the general ambient cold of the surrounding passage. One guide, in a conversation recorded by a paranormal investigation team, described the experience of stopping in the central passage of one of the deeper vault sections and becoming aware, without any identifiable sensory trigger, that the quality of the silence in the chamber had changed. Not that a sound had stopped, that the silence itself had a different texture, denser, more directed, less like the ordinary absence of sound in an empty stone room, and more like a silence that was occupied by something that was not making noise. The guide, asked to elaborate on this distinction, said that it was the difference between a room that was empty and a room where someone was holding their breath. That account resists easy categorization. It is clearly subjective, a described quality of perception rather than a measurable physical event. It does not appear in any data log. It cannot be replicated or controlled for, and yet it is consistent in its essential character with accounts given by visitors who have no long-term familiarity with the vaults and who described, in their own words and without prompting from this particular guide's formulation, the specific impression of a silence that was being maintained rather than simply occurring. The consistency is across people who did not know each other in a specific spatial location in accounts gathered across different years. It remains unexplained in the sense that no satisfactory account of why that impression should recur so consistently in that specific location has been offered. The question of suggestibility is worth holding at some length. Psychological research on the role of priming and expectation in anomalous experience is directly relevant to any reading of the vault accounts, and it would be an incomplete treatment to acknowledge it briefly and move on. The pre-tour narratives provided by vault guides are detailed, specific, and atmospherically rich. Visitors are told, before they enter, the name of the presence, the nature of what it sounds like, the locations where it has been reported, and the physical sensations associated with encountering it. This is not a criticism of the tour operators. The historical and reported narrative is part of what the tours offer, and the guides deliver it with evident care for both accuracy and atmosphere. But the effect of that preparation on visitor cognition is measurable and well documented. When a person enters an environment having been told that in this specific chamber, on many previous occasions, visitors have reported a sudden unexplained cold and the sensation of being followed, the threshold for interpreting an ambiguous sensory experience, a slight draught from an unidentified source, a sound the ear cannot immediately place, a moment of spatial disorientation in an unfamiliar space with unusual acoustic properties through a paranormal framework is substantially lower than it would be for a person entering without that preparation. This is not a judgment on those visitors' intelligence or sincerity. It is a straightforward consequence of how cognitive priming works in conditions of sensory ambiguity, and the Southbridge vaults are an environment specifically rich in sensory ambiguity, unusual acoustics, variable temperatures, closed stone walls that interact with sound in ways that are genuinely unpredictable, and a darkness that is only partially offset by the guide's torch. Carrying this psychological context carefully, the vault accounts do not dissolve. What they lose is the capacity to be read as straightforward testimony about objective external events. What they retain is their status as genuine and consistently patterned human experiences occurring in a specific physical location across many years and many independent individuals. The experiences are real in the sense that the people who had them. The question of what was generating those experiences, whether it was the environment, the preparation, something in the physical structure of the chambers, or something else entirely, is the question that has not been resolved, and the accumulated record of the Southbridge vaults is honest enough to leave it there. The specific passage most consistently named in the Mr. Boots accounts runs from the main accessible section of the vault network toward the sealed-off portion of the Nittery Street section. The ceiling in this passage runs low enough that a person of average height clears it comfortably, but feels the presence of the stone above in a way that affects posture and gait. The walls are close, the floor is uneven, the original stone worn in some places and interrupted in others by the accumulated sediment of 2 centuries of closure and the partial disturbance of archaeological investigation. The passage ends at a bricked-up threshold, a wall of later period brick set into the original sandstone arch, visually distinct from the surrounding stonework in a way that marks it clearly as a closure rather than an original feature of the vault design. It is in this passage, in the approach to this threshold, that the accounts concentrate. The footsteps are heard here. The localized cold is reported here. The locromagnetic field readings show their elevations here. Multiple visitors have described stopping at a specific point in this passage, not at the threshold itself, but some meters before it, and finding themselves unable to continue. Unable is the word several of them use. Adults unwilling, not simply deterred by the quality of the atmosphere, but unable in a way that they describe as physical, a resistance, a reluctance in the body that the will was not, at that moment, overriding. When investigators have asked these visitors whether they felt afraid, the answers are mixed. Some say yes. Others say that afraid is not quite the right word, that what they felt was more like the specific awareness that the space ahead was not one they should enter, a conviction that arrived without reasoning behind it and did not feel like their own production. These accounts come from people who entered the vault with every intention of walking the full route. They are not people who went looking for a reason to stop. They are people who stopped in a specific location and found, retrospectively, that they could not clearly explain why. The location where they stopped corresponds with notable consistency across accounts gathered at different times to the same stretch of passage, the same several meters of the Nidri Street Vault corridor, on the approach to the bricked-up threshold, in the section of the underground network that sits furthest from the stairwells and furthest from the ambient light and noise of the street above. Whether this consistency reflects a shared response to a genuine and consistent environmental variable, something in the electromagnetic field, the acoustic properties, the infrasound profile of that specific stretch of passage, or whether it reflects the predictable convergence of primed expectation toward the location the tour narrative has already identified as the most active, is precisely the question that the available evidence cannot answer. Both explanations are available. Neither has been ruled out. The passage remains, on either reading, the most documented single location within the Southbridge Vault accounts, and the Mr. Boots presence remains, on any honest reckoning, genuinely associated with it, across a body of testimony that spans the full period of the vault's modern accessibility. There is one further category of account from the vault sessions that sits outside the Mr. Boots material, but overlaps with it in location and character. A number of visitors and guides across the years have described the experience of physical contact, not a temperature sensation or an acoustic event, but the direct impression of being touched. The accounts describe a hand on the shoulder, a pressure on the arm, fingers at the back of the neck. In each case, the person, when they turned or reached for the source of the contact, found nothing. In each case, they were certain, in the moment, that the contact had been real, not imagined, not a trick of expectation, but a direct physical sensation of the kind that does not ordinarily require interpretation. The body knows when it has been touched. These accounts are fewer in number than the acoustic reports and the reports of localized cold. They are also, by their nature, harder to evaluate. A temperature reading persists long enough for a second observer to verify it. An audio recording can be played back. The felt sensation of a hand on a shoulder in a vault chamber by torchlight does not leave a record beyond the person who felt it, and the suggestion of contact in a dark, close space with unusual properties, and a prepared narrative context would seem to offer ample material for a straightforwardly psychological account of the experience. What is notable about the contact accounts is simply that they continue to appear in the accumulated visitor records, that they come from individuals who had not specifically anticipated this category of experience from the pre-tour narrative, and that they are reported with the particular conviction of people describing something that happened to their bodies rather than something they perceived at a distance. The vault guides who have worked the Nittery Street section over many years are consistent on one point that sits across all the categories of reported experience. The accounts do not follow a predictable calendar. They do not cluster around particular seasons, particular weather conditions, particular phases of the moon, or any other periodicity that would allow an environmental cause to be identified and documented. They appear across years of operation, across guides with different personal histories and different prior investments in the paranormal, across visitors with different levels of prior interest and different levels of suggestibility, across times of night, across tour group sizes ranging from a handful of people to the maximum permitted number. The one consistent variable is location. The accounts cluster in the deeper chambers. They concentrate in the Nittery Street passage approaching the sealed wall, and within that concentration, the specific acoustic signature, the sound of deliberate heavy footsteps in a space where no one is walking, appears with a frequency and a consistency that has persisted across the full period of the vault's modern history without diminishing. Independent paranormal investigation teams who have conducted overnight vigils in the South Bridge vaults are not a homogeneous group. They arrive with different theoretical frameworks, different equipment, different methodological commitments, and different prior dispositions toward both paranormal and skeptical explanation. Some are explicitly aligned with the paranormal interpretive tradition and approach the vigil with the working assumption that anomalous phenomena are present and documentable. Others arrive with a more rigorous empirical framework, treating the vault as a field location for the study of anomalous human experience in a measurable physical environment. The data these different teams produce differs in character and in the conclusions drawn from it. What it shares is a consistent finding. The deeper Nittery Street section of the vault network produces audio and environmental data that the teams, regardless of their prior orientation, find more difficult to account for with available mundane explanations than the data from the entrance sections and the more heavily visited parts of the network. That shared finding across teams with different assumptions and different methods is a piece of the overall picture that deserves careful attention. It does not confirm anything beyond the finding itself. It does not establish that the sounds in the recordings are caused by something paranormal, or that the electromagnetic field elevations are produced by anything other than the infrastructure of the building above. What it establishes is that multiple independent investigations, conducted without coordination and with different theoretical commitments, have independently arrived at the same spatial conclusion that something about the deeper Nittery Street vault section behaves differently in the instruments and in the reported human experience from the rest of the accessible underground network. The archived records of these investigations, the audio files, the environmental data logs, the logbooks of timestamps and coordinates, the written accounts of guides and visitors collected over years, sit now in a collection that has no formal institutional home, but has been maintained and added to by the operators and investigators who have worked the site. The records are incomplete, as any archive of this kind must be. Some were lost, some were never properly organized, some remain with the individuals who gathered them on hard drives and in folders that have not been collated with the broader body of material. What exists is enough to establish the persistence of the phenomenon across the full period of the vault's documented modern history, from the early years of guided access through the subsequent decades of accumulated investigation and visitor testimony. The Mr. Boots accounts begin early, and they continue. They have not faded as the vault has become more familiar and more visited. If anything, the picture has become more detailed as more accounts have been gathered and more investigators have added their findings to the record. A tour guide standing at the entrance to the Nittery Street passage in the middle of a session, holding a torch, the group behind her quiet and attentive, will sometimes pause. She has described this pause in several recorded accounts, not a dramatic moment, not a performance for the group. A genuine pause. She is listening. The passage ahead runs low and close toward the bricked-up threshold. The torch beam carries only so far before it diffuses against the sandstone and the arch above. Beyond the threshold, in the sealed sections that have not been opened since their original closure, the dark is complete. The pause lasts a few seconds. Then she speaks again, and the tour continues, and the group moves forward through the vault passages that have been opened since Norrie Rowan broke through that first sealed doorway in 1985. What she is listening for is the sound that named the presence, the sound of boots on stone in the empty passage ahead. She does not always hear it. She is the first to say so. She has led hundreds of sessions in these chambers, and the sound has come perhaps a handful of times, rarely enough that she remembers each occasion clearly, frequently enough that the possibility of it is always present when she pauses at that particular point in the route. When it comes, she said in one recorded account, it is not ambiguous. It is not the kind of sound that requires interpretation or filling in. It is the sound of boots, heavy, deliberate, moving toward the sealed wall or moving away from it. It is not always possible to tell, but moving in a space the map confirms is empty, in a direction that has no physical source she has ever been able to identify in all the years she has stood and listened for it. The passage beyond the guide's torch beam is still. The sealed wall sits in the dark, where it has sat since it was put there. The deeper chambers behind it, the sections of the vault network, too structurally uncertain for public access, continue in the dark beyond the torch's reach, cold, quiet, undisturbed. And somewhere in that darkness, at some point during some future session, a guide will pause again, and the group behind her will go still, and the stone of the passage will hold its characteristic silence. Whether that silence will break into the sound of boots on stone remains, as it has always remained, a question that the vault passages have not consistently answered. The reports have persisted across every investigation, and every season, and every change in who is walking the route above the bridge. The sound that gave the presence its name has been heard, described, logged, and argued over. And then the torch goes on, and the tour continues, and the passage behind the group returns to the dark from which it has never entirely departed. In the autumn of 2001, a group of volunteers walked into the South Bridge vaults, one by one, each carrying a small clipboard and a pencil, each following the same carefully laid route through the barrel-vaulted chambers beneath Edinburgh's streets. They had been given no description of what to expect. They had been told only to move through the space at their own pace, to stop wherever they felt the inclination to stop, and to write down what they noticed. The study had been designed by Dr. Richard Wiseman, a psychologist at the University of Hertfordshire with a long record of empirical work in the field of anomalous experience. And the South Bridge vaults had been selected precisely because they carried one of the most sustained and consistently documented histories of reported paranormal activity in the United Kingdom. The design was simple. The chambers were real. The question was whether what people reported inside them followed any pattern that physical measurement could account for. The answer, when Wiseman and his team compiled the results, was that it did. Not in the way that confirmed what guides had been telling tour groups for years, and not in the way that dismissed those groups' experiences as pure invention. What the data showed was something more specific and, in its own way, more interesting than either of those outcomes. Reported experiences, the sensations of cold, of presence, of unease, of something unidentifiable in the room, were not distributed evenly across the vault chambers. They clustered. They appeared with measurably greater frequency in certain rooms and in certain corners of certain rooms. And when the team overlaid those reports with their environmental readings, the clustering held. The environmental variable that correlated most strongly with reported experience was magnetic field strength. Certain chambers showed elevated and irregular electromagnetic readings. Those chambers were the same ones in which volunteers, moving through without any foreknowledge of where previous volunteers had stopped or what they had written, reported the greatest density of anomalous sensation. The pattern was not perfect. It was not complete. There were reported experiences in chambers with unremarkable readings, and there were chambers with elevated readings where nothing in particular was noted, but the correlation was statistically significant. It was real in the sense that a pattern appearing by chance would not have looked like that. Electromagnetic fields in the range Wiseman's team measured have been the subject of laboratory research, suggesting they can produce, under certain conditions, sensations of unease, of disorientation, and of a felt presence, the specific impression that someone else is in the room. The mechanism is not fully understood. The laboratory findings are themselves contested at the margins of the literature, but they represent a physical, measurable variable that corresponds to something people genuinely experience, and finding that variable elevated in the same chambers where visitors to the South Bridge vaults most consistently reported anomalous sensation was the kind of result that the study's design had been built to either find or not find. It found it. What that finding means, whether it explains the reports or explains only a portion of them, or whether other factors are operating alongside it, is a question Wiseman's published work holds open rather than closes. The vaults contain other physical variables that researchers have identified as potentially relevant. One of them operates entirely below the threshold of human hearing: infrasound, low-frequency sound waves generated by traffic moving above, by underground water shifting through old channels in the rock, by the particular acoustic behavior of large stone chambers under pressure, has been present in the vault environment continuously since the South Bridge was constructed. It moves through the sandstone, it travels through the mortar joints, it enters the chambers without announcing itself, because there is no frequency at which a human ear could register its arrival. What experimental research has established is that exposure to infrasound in certain frequency ranges can produce, in a proportion of people, sensations of anxiety, of undefined dread, and of the visual impression of something peripheral, a shadow at the edge of sight, a shape that resolves into nothing when looked at directly. The vaults generate infrasound. The vaults produce reports consistent with infrasound exposure. The research does not establish that infrasound explains those reports. It establishes that infrasound is present and that its presence is worth noting in the record alongside everything else. Locating Heinkrumsoundebandstern underbeat. There is a chamber in the deeper reaches of the Nittery Street section of the vault network, where infrasound readings, when they have been taken, show a consistent peak. The chamber is low-ceilinged and relatively narrow, with walls that angle slightly inward toward the top in a way that affects how sound moves within the space. Acoustic researchers studying similar stone environments have noted that irregular or converging wall geometries can produce standing waves, patterns of reinforcement and cancellation in the sound field that make ordinary environmental noise behave in ways that are genuinely difficult to locate or identify. A sound that arrives from one direction appears to come from another. A footstep from a distant corridor seems, within the standing wave pattern, to originate from directly behind the listener. A drip of water traveling down a far wall is heard, for a moment, as a voice. These are not hallucinations. They are properties of how sound moves through a particular geometry of stone. They are measurable, and they are in a chamber that visitors have consistently described as the place where they most clearly heard the sound of heavy boots in an empty passage, worth holding alongside the testimony with the same even attention the testimony itself receives. Sound in the vaults has been the subject of a great deal of informal recording and a smaller body of more structured investigation. The informal recordings, captured on personal devices by visitors and guide staff over many years, are numerous, and a proportion of them contain audio events their owners describe as unexplained. A footstep at a timestamp when no one was moving, a breath in a room where the recording was made alone, a low, indistinct sound in a section of passage beyond the tour route that the recordist could not account for when reviewing the file later, in daylight, at home. These recordings are in circulation. They are widely available. They remain in the language of the field, contested and unverified by independent scientific assessment, which means that no laboratory or acoustic research body with the appropriate equipment and methodology has subjected them to the kind of controlled analysis that would allow a definitive account of their origin. The question of what they contain is, as a result, still open. The acoustic properties of stone that could account for mislocated sound are well documented in the scientific literature. The specific chambers of the South Bridge vaults have been noted by structural assessors and acoustic researchers who have worked within them as producing measurably unusual sonic behavior, distant sounds arriving loudly, nearby sounds failing to carry, the barrel-vaulted ceilings focusing and redirecting noise in ways that vary depending on the frequency of the sound and the temperature of the air inside the chamber. On a cold night in winter, when the temperature differential between the vault interior and the street above is at its greatest, the acoustic behavior of the chambers shifts. The stone contracts minutely. The air column within the space changes its density. The standing wave patterns that characterize each room move and redistribute. What a guide heard last week in a particular corner of a particular chamber may not behave the same way on a Thursday in February. The vaults are, in this sense, a dynamic acoustic environment, wearing the appearance of a static one. They look like they have been still for 200 years. In acoustic terms, they change every time the weather changes above them. The overnight investigators who have spent extended periods in the vaults, setting up recording equipment, logging environmental readings, sitting in the dark waiting for something to happen, have produced a body of documentation whose relationship to scientific methodology varies considerably across the individuals and organizations involved. Some of the investigators who have worked in the South Bridge vaults have backgrounds in parapsychological research with connections to UK universities and research bodies. Their protocols, controlled conditions, standardized equipment, double-blind assessments of audio and visual material bring their work closer to the standards that academic reviewers would require. Others have worked with more informal methods, and their findings, while sincere, carry a different evidentiary weight in the record. The published literature produced by these investigations sits alongside Wiseman's work without displacing it and without being displaced by it. The studies reach different conclusions. The question of what those conclusions mean, taken together, has not been formally settled. One of the parapsychological investigators who conducted extended research in the South Bridge vaults in the years following Wiseman's study collected data that her analysis interpreted as consistent with a genuine anomalous presence in the deeper vault chambers. Readings and recordings that her published account described as not satisfactorily accounted for by the environmental variables Wiseman's team had identified. Her methodology was not equivalent to Wiseman's in its scale or its controls. Her findings are part of the available record, and they sit there with the same quiet persistence as everything else that has been documented about this place. Two sets of instruments, two research frameworks, two conclusions that do not align. The chambers that produced all of that data are still there, still accessible to the next person who brings a recording device and a logbook and a willingness to sit in the dark for several hours. The logbooks themselves have accumulated over decades into something that no single investigator or tour operator has fully collated. Mercat Tours, which has operated guided sessions in the vaults for many years, holds informal documentation of visitor experiences that stretches back across its history, accounts recorded by guides after sessions, incident reports from evenings when visitors became distressed or departed before the end of the tour, notes from guides who observed something they could not account for and wrote it down rather than leave it unremarked. The aggregate of that documentation has never been subjected to systematic analysis. It exists as a record of reported experience, accumulated over time, in a form that is neither scientific data nor anecdote in the dismissive sense. It is testimony, laid down with reasonable care by people who had a professional interest in distinguishing between the genuinely anomalous and the ordinary misperception that comes with moving through a dark and unfamiliar space. The guides who have worked in the vaults over many years hold their own accumulated experience of the chambers with a particular kind of pragmatic familiarity. They have made the route dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. They know which chambers tend to produce visitor responses and which chambers visitors move through without incident. They know that certain nights feel different from others in ways they find difficult to specify, a quality in the air, a silence that is not quite the same silence that the chamber usually holds. Some guides have declined to enter certain sections of the vault network alone, not as a performance and not as a guide script, but as a private decision made in the light of their own accumulated experience over years of work. Those decisions are not evidence of anything in particular. They are part of the record of what working in this space has been like for the people who have worked in it most consistently, and they belong in any honest account of what the vaults have produced in the way of human response. The temperature data that investigators have logged in the vault chambers forms its own layer of the accumulated record. The chambers maintain a low baseline temperature year-round, a consequence of their depth below the street, their stone construction, and the absence of any heating or ventilation infrastructure. And within that baseline, investigators have repeatedly noted localized drops, readings several degrees colder in specific corners or doorways than at the chamber's entrance, readings that do not correspond to the movement of air from ventilation sources or from the doors and passages through which visitors move. These localized drops are part of the reported phenomenology of the Mr. Boots presence. They are also part of the scientific record, logged by investigators carrying temperature gauges through the chambers in controlled conditions. What causes them? Air movement through sub-millimeter gaps in the sandstone, evaporative cooling from the persistent damp that has characterized the vault walls since the first decades after the bridge's construction, or something that neither of those explanations adequately accounts for, is a question the temperature data alone cannot answer. There is a doorway at the far end of one of the deeper Nidri Street vaults, where the temperature reading, when investigators have taken it, consistently falls at a point approximately 2 meters before the sealed stone wall at the passage's terminus. The wall is solid. There is no air source on the other side of it that the structural survey maps have identified. The reading has appeared in the logbooks of independent investigators working at different times of year, with different equipment, It sits in the record as a noted and recurring measurement at a specific location, with no explanation that any investigation has produced that entirely accounts for it. The passage remains accessible to tour groups as far as the rope that marks the end of the permitted route, approximately 3 meters from that point. Beyond the rope, the passage continues to the sealed wall. The temperature reading at that point continues to appear in the logbooks of investigators who have the access to take it. Wiseman's study, in its published form, was careful about what it claimed. The correlation between electromagnetic field readings and reported experience was real and statistically significant. The interpretation of that correlation, what mechanism it implied, what it said about the nature of the experience volunteers had reported, was held more carefully. The study did not claim to have explained paranormal experience. It claimed to have identified a physical variable that corresponded to it. That distinction is not a small one. Explaining a correlation is a different task from documenting it, and the published work stopped with intellectual honesty at the documentation. The explanation remains, in the formal sense, absent. The stone in the vault chambers is sandstone, quarried in the late 18th century from sources in the Edinburgh basin and laid by the workforce that constructed South Bridge between 1785 and its opening in 1788. Sandstone is a porous material. It holds water. It holds the impressions of the tools that worked it in the faint parallel marks that a chisel leaves in its surface. It holds, in the sense that it transmits rather than absorbs, the electromagnetic and acoustic fields that pass through it from the street above and from the geological formations below. It has been doing all of this continuously since the bridge was completed. The investigations that have passed through the chambers, the archaeological surveys, Wiseman's study, the parapsychological teams, the overnight investigators with their logbooks and their temperature gauges have each added a layer of documented attention to a space that accumulated its primary history before any of them arrived. The stone was here. The chambers were here. The long silence between the sealing of the vaults in the mid-19th century and their rediscovery in 1985 was here. All of that predates the investigations, and all of it continues alongside them. The instrument cases that have been carried into the South Bridge vaults over the years, the electromagnetic field meters, the infrasound detectors, the audio recorders with their directional microphones, the temperature gauges in their padded cases, the laptops running audio analysis software have all eventually been packed away and carried back up through the access door to the street above. The instruments have been switched off. The files have been saved and stored. The logbooks have been closed and set on shelves in offices and spare rooms. The investigators who carried those instruments have gone home. Some of them have published their findings. Some have presented at conferences. Some have filed the data in folders that remain on hard drives that have not been accessed in several years. None of them, working alone or together, has produced an account of what happens in the South Bridge vaults that has satisfied the full range of people who have a considered interest in the question. The case files remain open in the sense that no conclusion has been reached that the field regards as final. What Wiseman's volunteers experienced as they moved through the chambers with their clipboards was real to them in the moment of its occurrence. A sensation of cold that arrived without warning in a room that had, a moment before, felt merely cool. A feeling of being watched from a direction where, on looking, there was only the blank face of sandstone. A reluctance in certain doorways to step through. A reluctance without identifiable cause, noticed and written down, passing after a moment, leaving nothing except the note on the clipboard that something had been there. These were not invented experiences. They were reported with the careful specificity of people who had been asked to observe precisely. They correlated with the electromagnetic data. Whether the electromagnetic data explains them, whether it explains them entirely or partially, or in some other proportion that future research might specify, is a question that remains, as the study itself acknowledged in its published conclusions, genuinely and honestly open. The deeper sections of the vault network, the chambers beyond the areas covered by standard tour routes, the passages mapped by structural assessors but sealed against public access, the spaces that have not held a human visitor since the brickwork was laid across their doorways, sometime in the 19th century, hold none of this documented experience. They hold only what was left there before the sealing and what the stone itself has carried through the intervening decades. They are part of the structure. They are continuous with the chambers where the investigations took place, connected through the same sandstone piers and barrel-vaulted ceilings. Whatever acoustic and electromagnetic properties the accessible chambers have been found to possess do not stop at the sealed doorways. The infrasound generated by the traffic above moves through all of them. The damp moves through all of them. The weight of Edinburgh's streets presses down from above into all of them equally, without distinction between the lit and the dark. There is a quality that several investigators, writing up their notes after sessions in the vault chambers, have used different words to describe, but seem to reach toward the same impression. It is a quality of oldness that is also a quality of stillness, the sense in certain chambers that the air has not moved in a way that carried human breath for a very long time, and that this stillness has a weight of its own that is distinct from the mere absence of noise. Old buildings can produce this quality. Deep cellars can produce it. Stone structures that have been sealed and reopened tend to produce it with particular reliability. Whether this quality represents something scientifically measurable or is simply the subjective texture of being in a space with a particular acoustic and thermal character is not a question the existing literature has resolved. It appears in the notes because the people making the notes found it sufficiently distinct from ordinary experience to record. The footsteps that have been reported in the vault passages, the heavy, deliberate sound that gave the Mr. Boots presence its name, have been noted by visitors across many years in different sections of the vault network on different nights, by people who had no knowledge of each other's accounts. The acoustic properties of the chambers that could produce mislocated sound could carry a sound from one corridor and deliver it, redirected and transformed into a room where no sound should be arriving from that direction, are real and measurable. They represent a physical mechanism that acoustic research supports as a contributing factor to misidentified sound. They do not represent the full explanation of every reported incident, because some of the reported incidents describe sounds with characteristics, duration, cadence, directional consistency that the acoustic redirection hypothesis does not entirely account for. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and holding them simultaneously without resolving one into the other is what the evidence in its current state actually supports. The vault chambers continue to receive visitors on every tour night through the year, in groups that move slowly through the accessible passages by the light of portable torches, pausing where guides indicate, listening to accounts of what has been reported here across the decades of documented experience. The guides continue to carry their own accumulated knowledge of the space, the chambers that produce responses most reliably, the corners where the temperature most consistently dips, the passages where the acoustic behavior is most difficult to interpret. The tour operators continue to hold their informal documentation of visitor experiences, adding new incidents to a record that now spans decades, and the instruments, when investigators bring them, continue to produce readings that sit in logbooks alongside everything that preceded them, waiting to be set against whatever framework the next analysis brings. Weismann's data is still available. The parapsychological studies are still in the published record. The audio files captured by overnight investigators on the stone floors of the deeper chambers are still saved on drives and in cloud folders. The temperature readings logged at the far end of the Nidri Street passage are still in their logbooks. None of this material has disappeared. It accumulates slowly, the way sediment accumulates in a space that is sheltered from the forces that would otherwise disturb it, layer on layer, each stratum corresponding to a period of attention, each one compressed against the ones below it by the weight of what came after. The sandstone of the vault walls has absorbed none of this and holds none of it in any sense that physics recognizes. The stone does not know it has been studied. The chambers do not register the years of accumulated investigation. The barrel-vaulted ceilings continue to curve above the passage floor at exactly the height they were built to curve, in the same relationship to the stone piers that is held since 1788. The water that moves through the mortar joints when Edinburgh receives rain, the same process that drove out the commercial tenants in the 1790s, the same slow seepage that darkened the lower courses of every wall, in every chamber, continues to move, unhurried and indifferent, through the same paths it has always taken. The damp on the walls tonight is continuous with the damp that was there 200 years ago. The stone does not distinguish. Beneath South Bridge, at this hour the chambers are as they are between tour sessions, dark and cold and quiet, in the particular way that stone spaces are quiet, which is not silence, so much as the muffling of the sounds that remain. Traffic moving on the bridge above sends vibration down through the structure, in frequencies that no instrument carried by a human hand is sensitive enough to register at all. Water moves somewhere in the geological strata below the foundations. The air in the chambers holds the temperature it has been holding for days without change. The sealed doorways that separate the accessible vaults from the unmapped sections beyond them have been sealed for a very long time, and what they contain remains as it was left, undisturbed, unlit, continuing without the presence of anyone to observe it. The case files are on their shelves. The logbooks are closed. The instruments are in their cases, their batteries removed or depleted, their sensors at rest. The audio files sit in their folders with the same content they have always had: the footstep at the logged timestamp, the breath in the recorded room, the low indistinct sound in the sealed passage that no investigator has fully accounted for. The questions those files were brought to the vaults to answer are still the same questions they were when the first researcher arrived with a clipboard and a carefully designed protocol, and they are still open in the same way, with the same honest uncertainty about what would be required to close them. The street above continues in the way it always continues, foot traffic across the bridge's pavement, the particular sound of Edinburgh at night, the old sandstone face of the single visible arch lit from below, where it crosses the Cowgate, 18 other arches sealed behind the surrounding walls, and carrying the weight of everything above them. The bridge does what it was built to do. The chambers do what chambers do in the dark, when no one is present to observe them, which is to say that they hold their form, they hold their cold, and they hold the long quiet that has settled into them over more than 200 years of existence below the city's ordinary life. Somewhere in the deeper passages, in the chambers beyond the sealed doorways that no tour route reaches and no structural survey has recently inspected, the air is still. It has been still for a very long time. The stone walls hold the same damp they have held since the bridge's road surface was first laid without adequate waterproofing in the last years of the 18th century. The barrel-vaulted ceilings curve in the dark at the height they were built to curve, empty and precise. The infrasound moves through them without announcement. The electromagnetic field holds its particular character in certain corners. The questions that researchers have carried down into the accessible chambers and carried back up again without final answers extend without interruption into these sealed spaces where no instrument has yet been placed and no logbook entry has yet been made. The investigations continue in the way that open investigations continue, not actively, not always, but persistently. A new research team will eventually bring new instruments to the accessible chambers. New recordings will be made. New temperature readings will be logged at the same coordinates as the previous ones. The data will accumulate another layer. The case files will remain open